Today we're going to be going over the scaffolding of the face, the skull. I'm your sculpting instructor, Andrew Joseph Keith, and in this lesson, I'm going to get right up in your face. Right in your face! Or at least help you get right the faces of others. Let me share with you a quote by Edward Lantieri in his book, Modeling and Sculpting the Human Figure. I beg you to observe that the knowledge of the bones is even more important than that of the muscular system. And do not lose sight of the fact that anatomy teaches you the general laws of the human form, whilst the living model shows you the same laws applied and modified by individual characteristics. Pretty good quote. The skull is the most important bony feature to study and understand for figurative sculptors. And obviously, it's essential to understand if you want to master the portrait. In this video, we'll be going over the skull and sculpting a simplified version of the skull that gives us a good understanding of the anatomical forms without worrying too much about all the details. In the premium course, we'll be sculpting a more accurate skull and going over some of the important anatomy. So if you want that lesson, make sure you get the full premium course. Okay, let's get into it. You'll remember from the figure sculpting course how we went over the Loomis head. This simplified version of the head is a great abstraction because it gives us information on the primary forms of the head. To start sculpting the skull, we'll make a roughed out Loomis head with a few modifications. For more on how to sculpt the Loomis head, check out the video, How to Sculpt the Loomis Head. The distance from the top of the head to the bottom of the chin and from the front of the face to the back of the head is usually about the same. So the head makes this box. From here to here, here to here. We can cut off the bottom plane of the back of the skull behind where the chin ends. Let's add a center line to keep things symmetrical. For the features of the skull, we can then use a skull reference, like the Proco skull, available at proco.com/skull, or just any skull of a slaughtered enemy that you happen to have lying around. That'll work fine. We can then use the skull reference to draw out outlines of the features, take small pieces of clay, and build out the profile by adding clay to the center line that we've drawn in. You might prefer to start from the chin and work your way up to the forehead, or work from the top of the head down to the features, or even start with the nose and then build out the other features. It doesn't matter how you start adding those features of the face. Just be sure you build them on top of that center line that we've drawn in. You can close one eye and then hold the sculpture up to your reference, and that'll help you notice any discrepancies. One of the most common beginner mistakes is not having enough mass at the back of the head. This is probably because we're focused on all the interesting facial features, so we neglect the back of the head. Whatever the reason is, it's an amateur mistake, and it's easy to see once you've trained your eye and you've practiced sculpting the Loomis head with the correct proportions. Once we've got that accurate profile outline in place, we can then start to draw in some of the features on the side plane of the face. The cheekbone and eye socket are important to get right, so take your time to make sure that the angles that make up these features are accurate and that they are the right distance back from the profile of the face. Look for these lines when drawing the eye socket. Notice that these lines don't align perfectly with verticals or horizontals. They're more interesting than that. Carefully observe how the cheekbone transitions to the eye socket when you're observing it from the side view. Another beginner mistake is having the features like the eye socket and cheekbones too close to the front plane of the face. This means that the face will appear flat without the correct depths of the features. Well, you can also put the features too deep in the skull. This usually isn't the mistake that most beginners make. Usually, it's too shallow and flat. Once we've drawn in the outline of the eye socket and cheekbones, we can take some clay and add it to that outline to build out these features. Pay special attention to all the angles of the skull. We naturally want to move towards 90-degree angles or right angles, verticals and horizontals, and this is something that I see in poorly done skulls, like many of the cheap ones that you can get for Halloween. They look terrible. Just terrible. Look at the angle of the bottom of the jaw, for example. It's not a 90-degree angle. It's obtuse. In fact, if we lay this skull down on the table, you can see how the bottom of the jaw aligns with the back of the skull at the occipital protuberance. the little bump at the back of your head that you can feel. You feel that little bumpy bump? This means that the bottom of the chin, the back of the chin, and the occipital protuberance at the back of the skull often will align on certain people. The mound of the mouth is like a bloated cylinder, and it's important to understand how much this bends forward, moves forward in space when you're sculpting the mouth, the lips, the chin. I recommend working on both sides of the face simultaneously, switching back and forth to make sure that the angles and the distances are correct and that the features look symmetrical. It should be symmetrical when you look at the skull from the front view. If you finish one side before you move to the other side, it can be overwhelming to try to match all of those forms. Now that we've got something that's starting to look like a skull with the eye sockets, the cheekbones, the jawline, and teeth in place, we can start to clean up and simplify the forms. I try to pay special attention to the transitions between the forms, like the transition between the eye socket and the cheekbone to the mound of the mouth, or the jaw to the side of the skull. Remember, in this study, we're not going for an exact replica of the skull. We're going for a simplification that gives us the important landmarks and features that we should have in our mind whenever we're sculpting a portrait. Make sure that the high points of the skull are in place. Here you can see how I've marked out these high points in red tape to remind myself to check these specific areas. The widest point is at the back of the skull, and the head looks like an egg shape when you look at it from above. Cheekbones are the widest point of the facial mass, so the front part of the skull, this is the widest point, the back part, or the whole skull, the widest point is back here. The jaw is not as wide as the cheekbones, unless you have somebody just with a huge jaw. I'm going for something like this skull that I did in college, but I'm okay if it differs slightly in the way I represent the plane changes and line work along the skull. Here you can see how I'm switching from one side to the other to make sure that I'm maintaining the symmetry of the features and that the line work and planes feel right on both sides of the face. When everything's in place, I'll take a little bit of time to clean up the lines and try to give a consistent texture to the piece. For this exercise, it doesn't have to be perfect, and since I'm not going to make a mold or cast it, I'm okay with it being a little bit rough, but it should be pretty accurate with the secondary forms, the angles, and the depths that you would find in an average skull. And there we have it, one simplified skull. Stay productive, stay creative, and I'll see you in the next one.